Week 8 of the Big 12 football season. Was that maybe our best week yet? I'm Pete Mundo, Heartland College Sports. We cover the Big 12 Conference. We appreciate you joining us for the show, as always. What an incredible week of Big 12 football, and we are so glad you're here joining us to talk about it. If you're on YouTube and you haven't yet, as many of you haven't, but thousands of you have, subscribe to the channel right below and hit that thumbs up button on the video. It might sound silly, but trust me, it helps tremendously. And every week we have more. Thank you for doing that. Same thing on the podcast. Hit that 5-star rating and review. I can't thank you enough for being a part of the show. So week 8 in the Big 12 saw underdogs winning outright, saw near scares at the top of the conference. And that's where I will start the show this week. Welcome in. Thanks for being here. So Friday night, BYU was looking to get to 7-0. And Oklahoma State, coming off the bye week, said, in the words of Lee Corso, not so fast, my friend. We talked about it during the week in the preview. Mike Gundy has no business winning this game. The Cowboys have no business winning this game. And if not for a late drive by the Cougars in front of that home crowd with a minute left, Oklahoma State walks into Provo with an unlikely win. But when you've got that magic, when you've got that mojo, that it looks like this BYU team has some of, if not a lot of, this season, you walk out of a game like that with a victory. And that's exactly what happened on Friday night. It looked like Oklahoma State, who turned to Garrett Rangel. He gets hurt at the end of the first half. They go back to Alan Bowman. It looked like they were going to get it done. They finally got their running game going. Ollie Gordon went off with a couple of scores and over 100 yards. The defense wasn't good, but it was good enough. It was bend, don't break until at the end of the game, it ultimately broke. But when you're having the kind of season BYU is having, you win these games. You have the swagger, you have the confidence. Jake Retzlaff was able to have a big run, a big pass, of course, the eventual game winner to Darius Lassiter, and you end up walking out of there with a victory to get to 7-0 for the really second time since 2001. And that's where BYU finds itself. Now, Mike Gundy said after the game he doesn't think his team has a cultural problem. I don't believe he does. They put up a heck of a fight. But this team is not close to the team from last year. Now, there's two ways to look at this. Last year's team may have ultimately overachieved. The expectations for this year's team may have been too high because last year's team overachieved. But this team is better than what it's been the last month. They showed that on Friday night in Provo. It was closer to the team that we thought we see going into the game. But in the end, the defense continues to struggle. And as much as there's been a lot of attention of an offensive coordinator, Casey Dunn, I look at the defensive side of the ball, and Brian Nardo's in year 2, and this defense stinks to high heaven right now. When you look at what the Big 12 and this Oklahoma State team is doing on that side of the ball, they are the worst run defense in the Big 12 by a mile. They are giving up 298 yards per game on the ground. That's 108 yards more per game than anybody else in the Big 12. Cincinnati's got the second worst. Their pass defense is okay, middle of the pack, but not great. That unit is getting overlooked because of the offensive struggles, but this team did not lose because of the offensive struggles on Friday night. Now, on the other side of the ball, you look at BYU, and there was always a chance that BYU was going to have a game like this. But the good teams win these games. The teams that have that magic streak in them, I think of TCU a couple of years ago, they win these games. And BYU, if it was going to get to where it wanted to get to this year, get to a Big 12 championship, and maybe now we can talk college football playoff, these are the games that you win. Even when you're not playing your best, even when you find yourself in a situation where you lose the turnover battle, which BYU has dominated the turnover margin this year in the Big 12 and one of the best turnover margin teams in all of college football. They didn't have that going for them, and they still won the game. And that is a testament to this team, to Satake and this coaching staff, and to what they can potentially do the rest of the way. And BYU is sitting there at 4-0 in the Big 12, and they are in the driver's seat when you look at what's to come in this conference. Their schedule looks a lot softer the next few weeks than we thought it was going to be. At UCF, at Utah, versus Kansas. Before the season, this 4-game stretch looked like a gauntlet. Oklahoma State, UCF, Utah, Kansas. Those were all supposed to be teams that were contenders. Same with Arizona a couple of weeks back. None of them are. Now, it doesn't mean BYU can't slip up. Going to UCF, and then, of course, the Holy War on the road. Those are not going to be easy games because there still is talent on both of those clubs. But it's a lot easier stretch than what it looked like back in August. And that's why things are setting up very well for this BYU team moving forward. So BYU improved to 7-0. And then on Saturday night, you also had another team get to 7-0, and that would be the Iowa State Cyclones. And this one, just like BYU, these games were eerily similar. Needed a late drive in front of the home crowd to avoid the upset. These were the two biggest spreads of the weekend in the Big 12. Iowa State favored by a couple of touchdowns over UCF. BYU favored by 9 or 9.5 against Oklahoma State. Neither team covered. The teams don't care about that, but they avoided the upset with a late drive in the final couple of minutes. And for Iowa State, when they got that ball with a couple of minutes left on that final drive, and they got cooking early in that drive, did you at any point think they weren't going to go down there and win that game? Maybe you felt differently. But Rocco Beck, right out of the gates, completes a pass to Carson Brown. Then he runs for 8 or 10 yards. And I'm like, all right, this team's rolling. They have all the confidence, all the swagger. UCF's on its heels. It just felt like Iowa State was going to get that win. And then Rocco Beck finds Jalen Knoll for the big play down the field. And if you're a UCF fan at that point, you're saying to yourself, we're blowing this game. And that's ultimately what happened. And UCF finally got the offense back to where they think it needs to be. It's a great offensive performance against a very good Iowa State defense that came in as one of the best in not just the Big 12, but the country. You've got to be happy with where the offense was if you're a UCF fan. You guys were cooking on the ground, 354 rushing yards. Ja'Cory Brown showed you very nice dual threat abilities. I mean, wasn't great passing the ball, but was very good running the ball. RJ Harvey had an outstanding night, nearly 200 yards on the ground. You averaged 9 yards a carry against a very good Iowa State defense. But you couldn't stop anybody. Now, this is what we thought UCF was going to be. We thought that UCF was going to be a team that could put up 30 plus, 35 plus every game, but would give up 40. And that's basically what happened. And now if you're a UCF fan, it's like, man, what are we going to do with this defense? You knew it wasn't going to be great, but man, you've got to be questioning Ted Roof. And you can just ask Oklahoma fans about Ted Roof and how they feel about him. Not the biggest fans there in Norman. But Rocco Becht is continuing to put this offense on his shoulders. You are seeing that swagger come in more and more every game. He wasn't great throwing the ball in this one, by the way. But you saw Rocco Becht use his legs in a more effective way than what you've seen, frankly, during his career. He led this team in rushing on Saturday night. And he ended up with a couple of rushing scores. He had that big 2-point conversion late with his legs. And the more that becomes an element of this offense, man, watch out. Iowa State is going to be a team that can keep up with just about anybody in the country. And we posted this on our X page after the game. We had our guy Matthew Postins. He was in Ames covering this game. And Matt Campbell said something that I didn't think he'd ever say. Not because it's not true, but I didn't think he'd ever feel about a team like he felt about that 2020 team, that Brock Purdy team, Breece Hall, all those guys. But Matt Campbell, after the game, said at the podium, quote, "We have incredible leadership here. It's as powerful a leadership from the top down that I've ever seen." And that's him talking about his own team. That is a high level of praise from Matt Campbell and a guy who just recently, it's not like this is 15 years ago. It's been in the last half decade. had that group that got itself to a Big 12 championship and then went on to win the Fiesta Bowl during the 2020 COVID-shortened season. I didn't think that Matt Campbell would say something about his team like that anytime soon. And he's saying he's got better leadership. And by the way, this team is younger than that team, right? Look at the guys who are making all the differences, all the big plays. It's a younger team than that one. So that is enormous praise. And that tells you Matt Campbell knows how special this group is. To put those comments on this team, knowing what this program has had in very recent memory, is a stunning admission, but also a very positive admission to what Iowa State football is and can be this year. And you win a game like that, just like BYU. You want to get to the promised land, you've got to find ways to win games when you don't have your best stuff, when your back's against the wall, when you got to put together a 2-minute drive. And that is exactly what Iowa State did in this game on Saturday. So now 2 Big 12 teams come in at 7-0. Iowa State's got the bye week. BYU's in 2 weeks. And we are starting to see that separation at the top of the Big 12 standings. Now, let's bounce through the rest of the games here in the conference. Speaking of the top of the standings, Kansas State continues to creep towards the top of the standings, beating West Virginia 45-18 in Morgantown. And man, you look at the first half, and it was a one-score game. And then what happens? Well, West Virginia, we found out, courtesy of the radio broadcast, was going to be without 3 of its best players in the second half, led by quarterback Garrett Green and then Jaheim White at running back. And right away, you knew this was not going to go well. This game was basically over. Kansas State had the lead. They had control. And now the Mountaineers were going to be without 3 of their best players for the second half of the game. And at that point, it was game, set, match. And Avery Johnson continues to grow and get better. Now, this pick I gave you, Kansas State -3 in Morgantown, I liked that game a lot. I liked the pick a lot. It turned out to be right. Unfortunately, I went 1-2 on my picks after 2 straight 2-1 weeks. So a little bit of a setback. I gave you K-State -3. I had Arizona State plus the 5.5 at Cincinnati. And then I had Utah -3. So I missed out on 2 of those 3 games, but hit this one with K-State -3. And I thought that Avery Johnson was going to use that final drive against Colorado and really springboard him as a quarterback. And that's what you saw. You saw Avery Johnson throw for 300 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, very clean game. And it came at a time when the running game was solid for Kansas State, but it wasn't incredible. West Virginia was doing a pretty good job stopping the run, especially early in the game. But that was okay. Avery Johnson was able to put himself in a spot where this team does not have to run the ball anymore to set up Avery Johnson with the passing attack. He can just win you a game with his arm. And you're seeing that play out with this offense. Kansas State entered the night averaging 6.77 yards per play. They're now at 6.86 yards per play, which is 14th best in the country. And it's also on pace to beat the 1998 offense for the best in Kansas State history. That came from D. Scott Fritchen on X late on Saturday night. So that gives you an example of just how explosive this offense has been. And I thought that the offense for Kansas State was really going to pop in 25 because they had a new offensive coordinator, first-year starting quarterback. Giddens was a beast, but Edwards was young, new offensive line faces in there. I thought this year might be not a step back for the offense, but it wasn't going to be what people thought it was going to be. And thus far, that's just wrong. Kansas State's offense has been tremendous, and it looks like it's only getting better for the Wildcats. That's the scary part for the rest of the Big 12. Now, Neil Brown said after the game, this is the best team in the Big 12 to this point. And I think BYU and Iowa State might have something to say about that, but either way, West Virginia had just played Iowa State. Now they played Kansas State. Neil Brown has a pretty good feel for that stuff. But I can't help but wonder if Neil Brown's also covering his own butt a little bit here in saying something like that because, frankly, Neil Brown and West Virginia have now lost 9 straight games to ranked opponents. They came into this thing 3-15 against top 25 teams. Neil Brown is now 3-16 against top 25 teams, continuing a trend where West Virginia beats teams it's supposed to beat and loses to teams that it's supposed to lose to. They don't really upset anybody. They don't pull it off. And at some point, if you're Neil Brown, you got to win games. I'm not saying you got to beat all the teams, obviously, you're underdogs against. That's an unreasonable expectation. But can you pull off one or two? Right? Would it kill you to win a couple of ranked games once in a while? But West Virginia is becoming that team that, okay, they'll beat the teams they're supposed to beat. They're better than, but they just always lose to the teams that they're worse than on paper. Every single time. It's predictable. And that is very problematic for Neil Brown and for this program. And, I don't know what's going on with the injuries. I know that Green suffered what they called an upper body injury, even though it looked like it was a lower body injury when he had an issue there in the first half. But either way, you're looking at this team right now at 3-4 overall, and now you're just like, can we get to that bowl game? And we thought the first half of the season would be tough, but 3-4, it is fair to be underwhelmed as a West Virginia fan at 3-4 and saying, is Neil Brown really the guy? And I think many West Virginia fans right now would come to the conclusion that the answer to that question is no. Let's bounce through some of these other Big 12 games here for you on Saturday in the league. So Cincinnati beats Arizona State 24-14. And I'll tell you what, Cincinnati is a very quiet 5-2, a very quiet 3-1 in the Big 12. But what I saw from Cincinnati was a very balanced attack. With the passing game in Sorsby, with Corey Kiner in that run attack, they were able to methodically just take care of business against Arizona State. And I thought the Sam Levitt injury obviously would be a setback, but I thought they'd be able to take advantage of Cincinnati's rushing defense, and they did. Cam Scatterbo and this rushing attack had almost 5 yards a carry, 191 rushing yards. But when it came down to it late, I thought, made some bad decisions. They should have gone for it on fourth downs instead of kicking it. They knew that kicking game was weak and was going to need some work, and they elected instead to try a couple of field goals, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But all in all, I thought Cincinnati's defense just did what it had to do, knowing that for the most part, outside of being down 7-0 early, it was playing with a lead. And this is where I think this game really turned. Arizona State scored a touchdown on its opening drive. It was a very impressive drive. It was a team going 2 time zones to the east. Usually they're a little sluggish out of the gates. Arizona State punched Cincinnati in the mouth on that first drive. And I'm like, wow, okay, that's a great sign for Arizona State. And then you get the interception, right? And everything is in Arizona State's favor to open up this game. But then what happens, and this was very unlikely, Scatterbo fumbles the ball the first play after that interception, and what does Cincinnati do? They score a quick touchdown, and all the momentum is on their side after a turnover on downs by Arizona State on that very next drive. That leads to a Cincinnati field goal, and they never look back. And it was amazing how those couple of minutes there early in the game, I mean, that was still in the first quarter, felt like the game went from heavy Arizona State favor and very much an Arizona State momentum game to suddenly they get all the wind taken out of their sails, and you get a Cincinnati team that's suddenly picking itself back up, feeling good about itself. The home crowd is ripping and roaring there at Nippert for homecoming, and it turned on a dime. And then it felt like Arizona State was not going to be able to get out of its own way in that game, and that's exactly what ended up happening. So for Arizona State, Kenny Dillingham getting a lot of flack after the game. If you haven't seen this, the head coach basically said we're having open tryouts for a kicker. And then he goes on social media after the game, way after the game, and apologizes for being so tough on the kicking game. In part because, as he noted, if you criticize the offense, there's 11 guys. If you criticize the defense, there's 11 guys. When you criticize the kicking game, well, it's usually one guy that you're talking about, right? And that's where he came out and issued an apology on his social media and said, I want to apologize in my post-game press conference for how I talked about our kicking game like I do our offense defense. However, the kicking game is always directed at one player. I should not have done that, and I apologize. This team's losses will always 100% fall on myself. Hashtag Sun Devil for life. That's Kenny Dillingham. First off, listen, he's 34 years old, right? I've got him by a couple of years. Like, when you're in that kind of a pressure cooker in a post-game, emotional game, you're going to say stuff you regret, especially when you're still fairly green at being a head coach at this level. But you own up to it. You man up to it. And I respect Kenny Dillingham for how he handled that. Now, it doesn't change the fact that it's fair to look at this program right now and say, hey, the weakest part of this team is the kicking game. We got to figure this thing out if we want to compete atop the Big 12. So it's okay to do that. It's okay to admit that and say that. But obviously, how you say it and how you approach it matters. You don't want to throw your guys under the bus. And Kenny Dillingham took it like a man, apologized like a man, and that's all you can ask for in that spot if you are an Arizona State fan. Elsewhere, Kansas took out some of its frustrations, didn't they? Woo! I'm Pete Mundo. Heartland College Sports is how you find us covering the Big 12. If you are watching us right now, please do me a favor. Hit that thumbs up right now below the video. I know there's many of you watching who have not done it. So do that for me real quick. It makes a big difference as you're watching. And also subscribe to the channel if you have not done that yet here on YouTube and also on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. Quick note, if you have had any issues with the podcast uploading, we got a new server, new host for the podcast. So just send me an email, petemundo@heartlandcollegesports.com, if that's been an issue for you, because a couple of people have reached out and I don't know how broad that issue is. So just drop me a note, petemundo@heartlandcollegesports.com. So let's talk about Kansas. Off the bye week, they blow out Houston 42-14. And just a quick story for you. I'm going out to get takeout for the family on Friday night. And for those of you that don't know, I live in the Kansas City area. And I'm going to get takeout, place we go all the time. And I'm going to turn left into the restaurant. It's right off the highway where we live in the Kansas City metro. And these state troopers stop traffic. And I'm like, what are they doing? They stop traffic and these buses start rolling through towards a hotel. And I'm like, huh. And then I see the big Jayhawk logo on the buses. So KU is staying just a couple of minutes away from my house before they're playing this game at Arrowhead Stadium on Saturday to take on Houston. I'm not going to tell you where that is, but I just thought it was interesting. Life comes full circle. But now, if I want to crash Lance Leipold's hotel party the night before games, I guess I could very well do it. But as somebody who's got 3 little kids at home, it's not in my immediate plans. I just wanted to share that with you because I thought it was interesting on Friday night. I'm like, oh, there they are. They're 2 minutes from the house. Okay. All right. Welcome in, fellas. Welcome to the neighborhood. So KU looked like a team that got a lot of frustration from the last month out of its system against Houston. And this is the KU team that we thought we'd see. Now, this game was going on with 2 other games. KU Houston, Colorado, Arizona, and Baylor, Texas Tech all started within 30 minutes of each other. This game was on ESPN+. And KU jumps out to a very early lead. They score a touchdown on their opening drive. Big-time opening possession for KU, and they were not messing around. They went for it on 4th down, obviously, inside the 5-yard line, and that's exactly what they needed to do. On that opening drive, taking 3 points would have been a joke. You're 1-5, you go for the touchdown there, and that's what Lance Leipold did. You get an interception on the next drive, you score another touchdown, and then you open up the game with 4 straight touchdown drives, all of at least 50 yards, I want to say, and 2 or 3 of them were over 75 yards, and you're cooking. It's 28-7. And if you're a KU fan, you're like, where has this been all season? Well, Jalen Daniels looked like what we thought Jalen Daniels was going to be. Right? Threw for 250, 3 touchdowns, no turnovers. The team didn't have any turnovers. He rushed for 50 some odd yards. Neal had over 100. Like, KU and how it played against Houston. If you told me in August, KU beats Houston 42-14, and Daniels has his stat line, and Devin Neal has his stat line, and KU wins the turnover battle 4-0, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. But then if you tell me that game means KU is 2-5, I'm like, what are you talking about? They're 5-2, maybe, if not 6-1. 2-5? Well, they've just blown all these late games. But that bye week appears to have come at a good time, right? This is exactly who we thought Jalen Daniels was going to be all season. But the dude hadn't really played in 2 years. And to think with a new offensive coordinator, with a guy who hasn't played in 2 years, who might be a little gun-shy with the injuries, well, okay, suddenly now it makes sense. Now, I didn't buy the KU hype. I'm not saying I was right. I had Utah and UCF in the Big 12 championship game. So I'm not sitting here saying, look at me. Now, please, if you had BYU having the season it's having, if you had Cincinnati and Arizona State having the seasons they're having, please go buy yourself a lottery ticket. But the one thing, or one of the couple things I was right on before the year, was KU. I thought the hype was too much based on what they had lost on the coaching staff, especially at OC, most notably at OC, and then also the Jalen Daniels hype train just being a little too hot. But with a week off, figure this thing out, get comfortable again, get your mind off of things for a little bit. You saw what KU is capable of being. And dang, it was impressive. There's no doubt about it. Now, of course, they can win out, or they could lose one game still and get to a bowl game, which would be good for this program. But you saw the defense. They were all over the field. They had 6 sacks and 12 tackles for loss. I mean, they held Houston, which offense looked pretty good a couple of weeks back against TCU, 3 yards a carry, and obviously Donovan Smith had to come back in the game. He threw 3 picks. So they were impressive as could be. Kobe Bryant had a game of a lifetime on Saturday with 3 picks. So that is exactly what you're looking for out of this Kansas team. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Big 12 race, it's just too little too late. That's the problem there for KU. Moving on. Colorado, baby. I'm seeing a lot of Colorado fans in the chat. Welcome in, folks. And as some of you are saying, it is great to be back in the Big 12. Well, guess what? We're happy to have you back in the Big 12. I love having Colorado back in the Big 12. You all should have never left. I get why you did, but just a quick memo. You should have never left. So Colorado blasts Arizona 34-7. And the scariest part for Colorado, or the scariest part for the Big 12, is that Colorado, with all the transfers, was always going to be a team that, if things were working, would get better throughout the season. And Colorado's been pretty good in the trenches on the defensive side. The question has been the offensive side. Well, guess what? Both those lines of scrimmage are coming together in a big way. I know Arizona's a shell of what we thought they were going to be, but just look at these numbers, okay? The Colorado defensive front has been very good, underratedly good. But on Saturday against Arizona, they had 7 sacks and 7 tackles for loss. And on the flip side, Colorado and the offensive line was able to limit Shedeur Sanders to taking just 1 sack on the game. Arizona only had 3 tackles for loss in the game. Colorado had 4.4 yards per carry, which is unheard of for the Buffaloes this season. They had averaged around 3. And it's amazing how much better Shedeur Sanders looks. He's looked really good, obviously, all year. We know that. He's at the top of the Big 12 in all the stats. But he looks even better when he's got a little time to throw the ball. You saw him spread the ball around beautifully to 9 different wide receivers in this game. And that's the scary part for the Big 12. I mean, look at Colorado. They're a drive away against Kansas State from being 4-0 in Big 12 play and being right there at the top of the Big 12 standings. They're still right there at 3-1, But I'll tell you what, it is great to have this team back, not just because they're winning, not just because of Deion Sanders and all the pomp and circumstance, but I just love having the old school Big 12 feel back a little bit. And I know this was in many eyes of many fans like a Pac-12 game between Colorado and Arizona. I still feel like Colorado's deep down a Big 12 team. Heck, they were in the Big 12 longer than they were in the Pac-12, right? It might be actually about even, but either way, it's close. Arizona is a freaking mess, though. Noah Fafita looks like a shell of what he was. He holds the ball longer than anybody in the Big 12 back there after the snap. I saw that show up on the screen on Saturday, and I knew he held it for too long, but when I saw he was like worse in the Big 12, 3-point-something seconds on average, bro's got to get rid of the ball. But this offense is horrible. And I didn't think we'd be saying that. I thought this team might lose games. I thought it'd be like 42-38, not scoring 7 points a game. I mean, look at this Arizona team. They are averaging in Big 12 play under 18 points a game. That's only better than Utah and Houston. That's horrible. And I didn't think they would miss Jedd Fisch this much, but Jedd Fisch leaving, and you combine that with this season, they set this program back years. That's how dicey it is right now for Arizona. They could be, if they don't right the ship, if they don't get this thing corrected, they may find themselves in a position where they are a doormat in this conference for the foreseeable future. And I hope they can turn things around, because I've always believed that Arizona could be a sleeping giant in college football, but they look horrible right now. There's no big play offense there whatsoever. I mean, it's just bad. And they were a favorite in this game, a favorite, which in hindsight looks foolish, but they were a favorite in this game, and they got owned in every single facet of this game as well. Every single one. Penalties, they're a sloppy team, more turnovers. Nothing about this Arizona Wildcats team looks good right now. And they've got to figure out a way to get this thing turned around, and turned around fast. 2 more games to dive into here as we roll through the afternoon. Baylor blasting Texas Tech 59-35. So nobody needed this game and this win more than Dave Aranda. They were 0-3 in the Big 12. They were coming off a bye. A lot of talk about Aranda's job security, but the Baylor administration has stayed pretty well behind him, to their credit. But he had to start winning. And basically, since that Hail Mary against Colorado, they just have not looked like themselves. I always thought Baylor was a decent team. I bet them a lot this season, right? I went like 3 straight weeks betting Baylor, and unfortunately, I came up short every time. Now, I bet them in the Colorado game, which was seconds away from being a win until that Hail Mary. I bet them in the BYU game. They came back late but couldn't cover. Then they got smashed at Iowa State. Have the bye week, perfect timing. They go to Lubbock, and I mean, they scored 5 straight touchdowns in the second half. Speaking of working out your frustrations, that's what Baylor did in this game against Texas Tech. And it was, I mean, on the ground, they were fantastic. Almost 8 yards a carry on the ground, 255 rushing yards. I thought the defense played a pretty darn good game as well, especially in that first half. I mean, late, you're up by 20 some odd points. The final box score may not look as impressive, but I thought the defense actually had itself a really solid game for this Baylor team. I thought Matt Jones, I mean, every time I looked up, Matt Jones was making a play. Guy was having passes defended, sacks, tackles. He was all over the place. And he was clearly the engine on that defense. Steve Linton had himself a tremendous game as well. So these guys were all over the field for the Baylor Bears. And it's closer to what I thought this Baylor team was capable of being this year, right? So now, if you're a Baylor fan and you're looking at the schedule, you're like, hey, we got Oklahoma State this weekend. That's winnable. TCU feels winnable. They don't have a ranked team left on the schedule. So Baylor can get itself 3 wins of their next 5 games. I mean, they are capable of doing that. Will they? I don't know, but they're capable of doing that. But as good as they looked, that is as bad as Texas Tech has looked since the Abilene Christian game, but really, I would say dating back to last year. For Texas Tech and this Joe McGuire team to come out of a bye week and looking that flat in front of your home crowd is a bad look. There is no other way to put it. It is a bad look. And I was surprised at how flat they looked. It's like these guys spent 2 weeks listening to the fans tell them how great they were. And frankly, they didn't have any reason to feel like they were that great. I know some Tech fans have been mad at me because I have not really bought into this Tech team. I mean, I've had them fifth or whatever in my power rankings, but I've been like, hey, I've got to see more from Tech. I just haven't been all that impressed, in part because of the competition, right? And the one pretty good team they played, Washington State, they got smashed. I know Taj Brooks wasn't there for that game, but come on. And Arizona State and Cincinnati were solid teams, but they were at home. Arizona on the road, all right, Arizona's not all that good. So I'm just like, I've just got to see a little more. And what we saw on Saturday was an ugly freaking mess. That is a punch in the gut to this Texas Tech team and to the program at large right now. Now they're 3-1 in the Big 12, so you're sitting there and you're like, hey, we're still in a good spot. Okay, true. You should feel good about that. But I was so underwhelmed with how they came out in this game. And, obviously there were special teams issues as well that led to Baylor touchdowns. The offense really wasn't clicking. It didn't feel like it at any point. But here's when this game turned. This Baylor-Texas Tech game turned when Baylor had the ball in the third quarter after Texas Tech opened up with a touchdown. They pulled it to 24-21. And Baylor goes 9 plays and 75 yards in 5 minutes for a score. They go back up by 10. But on that drive in particular, there was a key play. It was a 4th and 2 in Texas Tech territory. And Dave Aranda, even a couple of weeks ago, might have kicked a field goal there, or at least tried a field goal there, because he's a defensive guy, a little more conservative. Aranda might have been like, let's just try to kick a field goal. Let's take the points. Let's try a 40-yarder, 42-yarder, 43-yarder. He went for it. And those are the kind of stones that Dave Aranda needs to start having more of. And just trusting his guys and saying, you know what? No, gas to the pedal. I've got the horses to do it. And he ran Sawyer Robertson, and he got the first down, and they scored a touchdown 2 plays later. That's what needs to happen for this Baylor team. And that, to me, was a message from Dave Aranda to his guys on the road with the momentum of that game possibly changing. I trust you. I believe in you. Go do the damn job. And that right there was a play that I thought changed this game, and Baylor never looked back after that score. Last but not least in the Big 12, TCU beating Utah in an ugly 13-7 game on Saturday night. Another team, TCU, coming off a bye week and looking like it's got a little mojo. I don't want to take anything away from TCU because they're 2-2 in the conference. They're better than Utah. They cleaned up the turnovers. They had been the worst team in the Big 12 in turnover margin the last few weeks. So they handled that much better, although Hoover still had a fumble. He wasn't throwing interceptions left and right. He wasn't trying to do too much, although he got away with a couple of throws that could have been picked off. But overall, you take it, right? Improvement. Utah's season is finished. And as much as it is partially about Cam Rising and the injury, there is more to it than that. This team has a stout defense, especially up front, right? That's where it's best. Although it hasn't been great this year. It hasn't, I would say, met expectations when you look at the defense for Utah. It's been solid. But the offense has no juice to it. The running game has nothing going for it. And the passing game, which we thought would be better than it's been, just hasn't been there at all. It hasn't. Whether it's Cam Rising or Isaac Wilson. And the story of this game is that Utah's season is unofficially over when it comes to the Big 12 race before Halloween. And that is not something I thought I'd say. If you told me BYU would be in its position and Utah would be in its position before Halloween, I would have called you crazy. But here we are. And it's Utah who now is looking and saying, let's plan for 2025. And it's Utah that's hoping to play spoiler in the Holy War in a couple of weeks, not BYU. And that is something else that nobody would have ever seen coming. It is officially a lost season for Utah. It is something that Utah fans should be very disappointed in based on the fact that they were picked to win this league in their first year in the conference. And they're not just losing to some of their old Pac-12 foes, right? I mean, a lot of talk the last couple of weeks of, well, Utah's losses aren't to the Big 12 teams. They're to the Arizona schools. Well, now they lost to a TCU team that, frankly, I still don't think is all that good. And it was at home, and it was an ugly loss where they scored all of 7 points. And it was a TCU team that was fresh off a loss to Houston a couple of weeks prior. That is a bad Saturday night in Salt Lake City, and that is a bad turn of events for this Utah team. I'm Pete Mundo. We are Heartland College Sports is where you find us. We cover the Big 12. As always, thank you for being here. If you have not yet done it, do me a favor. All our stuff is free. All I ask for you is to hit that thumbs up button on the video on YouTube. It means a lot more than you think it does. And subscribe to the channel as well. Same thing on the podcast. Drop that 5-star rating and review. We will have so much content coming your way this week. I've got Tim Brando on the show this week. Another reason you want to make sure you are subscribed. So go to heartlandcollegesports.com. We also have free forums for you there. We're interacting all the time with Big 12 fans all over the country. Have an awesome day. Go Big 12. We will talk to you soon at heartlandcollegesports.com.